Okay. Good afternoon, everybody. I hope you're all doing very well and have enjoyed your lunch break. My name is Matt Henderson. I'm the Chief Commercial Officer for Ethical Intelligence Associates Limited. Try saying that with, without a cup of coffee in you. So the purpose of this workshop today is to find out how ethics can be embedded into an AI startup strategy. So I'm going to pass it over to the Olivia Gambelin, CEO of Ethical Intelligence.
Thanks, Matt. And we're going to figure out how to balance between slides and hybrid and interactive. And so I'm going to signal next slide, and we're going to see what happens here. So this is a journey that you are on with us. You know, as we are a young company ourselves and we work with startups, we like to do things by the seat of our pants. So that's what today is going to be like. Thank you. That actually works a lot better. So this is the workshop on embedding ethics, how to create an ethics strategy for your AI startup, presented by both Matt and myself. Matt already gave his introduction. I'm Olivia. I'm the founder and CEO of Ethical Intelligence, and I'm also an AI ethicist by trade. So I'm going to speak a lot on our work today. This is an interactive workshop. We're going to be using Mentimeter, and we'll probably be known as the QR code people by the end of this, because there's a lot of them throughout the entire workshop. Raise your hand for yes or no questions. We will take questions at the end, and feel free to take pictures. You can tag us on Twitter. Our social media manager will love you forever if you do. We're terrible at taking pictures, so she's been begging us to take pictures throughout the day. So let's start with the first question. Why ethics? Why are you here? Why does this matter for startups specifically? Could stand here and tell you, well, ethics helps reduce time and cost for your company, yada, yada. These are the usual, the usual benefits, we'll say, but that's more for large corporation. Why does this actually matter for startups specifically? Ethics is essential to startup success for three main reasons. The first one, it increases customer loyalty. By building ethical products, by building ethics and embedding ethics from the start of your company and your product, you're actually building a product that people can trust, and that will increase that loyalty, because as your clients, as your customers that are using your product are trusting in that product, they're much less likely to move away from that product. So it increases your customer loyalty, which in the world of startups, it's a very highly competitive space. You want to compete and make sure that you are competitive on the market when you are trying to sort through multiple different apps. Being an ethical company makes you stand out. Second one is you attract and retain top talent. Top talent will make or break a startup. If you have the right people working on your team, you are increasing your chances for success. And by having a company with purpose and with values, you're actually attracting in the top talent that exists. We're seeing the Great Resignation right now, but on the flip side of the Great Resignation, we're seeing people want to work for purpose and want to work for a company with good values. So if your company has a strong mission and good values and an active way that displays how that is carried out, then you're going to be attracting in, again, the people that are going to make your startup, but also retain them throughout the process. Last, more favorable exits. So by incorporating ethics, what's happening is you're actually creating a product that large corporation will want to buy. We actually know of a couple different cases out in the Silicon Valley where there are deals starting to be turned down because a startup is questionable with their technology. Just a month ago, Microsoft turned down a deal, $1.5 million, to procure a startup because the startup wasn't built ethically. This is starting to matter. So this is why ethics specifically matters for the success of a startup. And I'm not talking large corporation, I'm talking startup. You want your customers loyal to you, you want your top talent, and you want a good exit. And that simply is why ethics matters so much. So cool, we know why. We know why we want ethics, but what is ethics? It's a very big title. It's a very big name. It can be very vague. What is ethics actually? Well, if you boil it down, it's the study of right and wrong. Now, that is a very simplified statement. Ethics is a complex, beautiful field. There's lots of different nuances to it. There's lots of different layers. But at the end of the day, we're all asking the same question of what is right and what is wrong. What is good? What is bad? How does this look in action? These are all ethical questions. But what does it mean, again, in terms of a startup? So our life exists on a spectrum. You have your worst case scenario and your best case scenario. Worst case scenario, you've got a terrible life, everything's gone wrong. Best case scenario, everything's great, peachy, you're on cloud 9. Our technology exists on that same spectrum. We're talking with startup founders, we're talking about worst case scenario, AKA the dumpster fire. So everything's gone wrong, your customers hate you, you've caused all these problems, you've got the government after you, all these startups' worst nightmare. That's the worst case scenario. Best case scenario is not actually nothing's gone wrong, but instead everything's gone right. We actually have a strong product on the market. We have that product market fit and adoption rate that we're looking for. And we're getting that feedback from our users saying, this is amazing. I'm so glad I had this in my life. That's the best possible outcome. Now, how does ethics work into this? Well, ethics is the tool that we use to prevent the worst possible outcome and actually gear us and make decisions towards the best possible outcome. So it's the tool really, literally that we use to exist on that spectrum and move back and forth. So what we're doing when we're looking at our technology, especially as a startup, because you're so early stage that you have the ability to make these decisions, what we're looking at as a startup is where are we on this spectrum and what decisions need to be made to move us towards the best possible outcome and away from the worst possible outcome. So this is a workshop, this is interactive. We are gonna do something called Doomsday, which is the literal dumpster fire now on the screen. But Doomsday is something that we actually run with all of our clients during their onboarding process. We call it Doomsday to keep it lighthearted, which seems ironic considering you have a dumpster fire on the screen and I'm saying this is lighthearted. But we do this to be able to break down the hesitancy and the worry about, well, our technology can't possibly do anything wrong. It'd be bad. We'd be bad people if we created technology that could create a dumpster fire, that could create all of this harm. So we call it Doomsday because what we do is we create a situation, we create the space needed for clients and companies to come together and teams to come together to sit and have a discussion of what is that worst possible outcome? And we're gonna stretch our minds and creativity. What is that worst possible outcome? And then we flip it on its head. What's the best? And what this does is it allows for the conversation that oftentimes people are too afraid to breach. So we're gonna do a little experiment. We're in person and hopefully a little bit on Zoom, but we'll do this a little bit ad hoc all together here. We're actually gonna do a little mini Doomsday. So we are going to use a mental health application as our technology. So we all work for a startup. I probably should have come up with a fun creative name, but a mental health startup.
Mental AI.
It sounds, I love it. So we are mental AI. We are all in different positions within the company. Pick your favorite. We can all be CEOs if we feel like it, or developers, whatever you feel like. But we're all part of mental AI. And we're creating this app that helps you track your mental health. Now, it tracks the time of day that you're sleeping, what you're eating, and your physical activity. And it'll tell you, hey, you're dipping in your habits and your mental health might be suffering, and try and give you some directions on go talk to someone, go take a walk. Now, what could possibly go wrong with this? How could this be misused? And just think crazy ideas. The wilder, the better. But really what we're trying to do is we're trying to stretch our mind to understand how this could go wrong so that we can put up the guards to ensure that it doesn't. So, interactive workshop. I know we're mic'd. I think we might repeat it for Zoom. Again, as I said, we're experimenting on this hybrid version. But would love to hear from you. What could possibly go wrong? You have that accidental addiction of, am I well, as you're checking the app. Yeah, a great example. Yeah, exactly. What if someone hacked it? How could they mess with someone's mental well-being? That would be massive. This is mental health data is considered protected health data. And so that would be terrible for the company and the users at the same time. Other ideas? Yeah. Bad for the user, bad for the company at the end of the day. One of the questions a lot around mental health apps is what happens after the problem is identified? What kind of support comes from that? Is it more detrimental to the user to be told, hey, you're suffering, than to actually just have help provided? How does that work? It can become a situation where if the app's notifying the person, in some cases, they can be legally liable to if that person ends up in a suicide position because they knew or they had the ability to know. So these, again, this is worst case scenario. Others? Yeah. How do we know what is someone's mental health and what isn't? If it's inaccurate, say you are mentally healthy, you're questioning yourself, am I actually mentally healthy? Or vice versa, you feel almost gaslit. How do I know? I thought I am suffering, but I'm not. Other ideas? Don't worry, we won't stick on the negative for too much longer. Yeah, I could imagine people wanting to do ads through the mental health app. That's not very helpful. Is that really someone's best intentions in mind? Exactly. Okay, enough negative. Let's flip it into the opposite direction. What could go right? What would be an amazing mental health app that you could use as a tool, as a user, or as a company as well? What could go right in this situation? Exactly. I apologize. I've taken so many tests. It is not COVID. It is the change of weather and a poorly timed head cold. So stressing that. I'm going to try and not cough into the mic. But exactly, you can be proactive. You can get on top of it before you hit rock bottom. Other ideas? Get you that help when you need it. Excuse me. I was good until I got up here.
Exactly, you can start to understand the patterns of thinking that may lead you down certain pathways that lead to detrimental mental health. Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's a lot of power in being able to understand the external influences, how you're feeling, being able to take that into your own power and your own agency. Yeah. See, there's so many possibilities as we start to look at this. What could that best case scenario be? This is the same app. We're all still at Mental AI. We're all still working on the same product. But you start to see it's a lot about the intention and understanding how do we bring this product towards that best case scenario that we're all talking about, and how do we prevent it from going to the worst case scenario? All of those decisions along the way, we're using ethics as a tool. So hopefully with this activity, we got a little bit of our Zoom calls on here as well. Hopefully with this activity, you started to open up and understand, okay, we know why we want ethics. We know that we need it. We know that it's helpful in understanding how to move into that best case scenario. Question is how? It's all great, but how does this work? Literally, how do we do ethics? So first of all, we need a strategy for implementation. It's all well and good to have a list of company values and a mission statement, but what does that actually look like in practice? Do you have a strategy to actively implement that? Can you, in some cases, start to measure how well you're implementing these values? And of course, this is an ongoing journey. This is not a one and done. This is a company life cycle strategy that we're developing here, which is incredibly important. The sooner you start, the sooner you're on that journey. It's weird to see myself on the screen. So a strong ethics strategy, which is what we're going to dive into in that how. A strong ethics strategy has 3 pillars: technology, people, and process. And we're going to go through all 3. Let's start with technology. Now, we did warn you that we were going to be the QR code people. Here you are. This is the start of the QR codes. So part of this questions, you're going to have 2 questions here. If you are representing an early stage startup, so anywhere from seed to series A and B, technically pre-market fit, you are on the left side. If you're later, you are on the right side with late stage, or pick which one you identify with, or the company that you're currently with, where you fall into this. There's 2 questions. We're going to show the polls live. We're crossing fingers. We're going to show the polls live, but this is to get us a little bit set up.
There are some codes as well at the bottom if the QR codes aren't working, just strings of numbers, so they should just pop up there. You can go to menti.com to find that.
And it works. This is exciting. So on the, we have some of our results coming in. So when we're asking the question about, have you thought about the consequences of your technology? What we're doing is we're asking questions about intentional design. Are you going through the process of thinking what you are building? Are you understanding what are those unintended consequences? Remember, during Doomsday, we were talking about what could possibly go wrong. All these things could go wrong. What could possibly go wrong? Those are unintended consequences. We don't want them to happen. We're not setting out for them to happen, but there are certain decisions that can be made that things will happen. All the purpose of intentional design is to understand what could go wrong and how do we make sure that we're designing against that, but also designing for the better picture. So that's our first question. The second one that we're looking at, do you promote fairness in your AI software development? So we're looking at fairness and bias. We're looking at inclusivity. We have 2 different styles of information up here as well. But what we're looking at in terms of fairness is when we're building that technology, are we considering the bigger picture? Are we considering diversity factors and inclusivity? Do we have the right people at the right table with the voice that's needed? So these, intentional design and fairness, are two main principles of building strategy around technology. All right, we're gonna flip back to the slide now, we think. Perfect. So what are we doing when we're building a technology strategy? And remember, this is one of 3 pillars. What are we doing when we're building for technology? Well, we're looking at the technology itself. What we're literally doing is we're sitting down like we did today and looking at what's the worst case scenario, what's the best case scenario. But then we're trying to work out and understand, how does this fit into a bigger picture? Really what we're trying to do, specifically in the startup case, is break through something called founder's bias. So founder's bias is when you come to the table, and you don't have to be a founder, you can be someone also working in a startup or someone in say, a product management role. Founder's bias is when you say, my technology can't possibly do anything wrong because I'm a good person and I want to do good and I'm setting out to do good. That's good, but it doesn't mean that bad things can't happen. I know this sounds very risky and very risk adverse, but in addressing and owning the fact that things can go wrong, what you're doing is you're actually empowering yourself. You're saying, hey, I have identified this and I know how to work against it. So when we're building a strategy around technology, we are looking at how do we prevent those bad things from happening and how do we go in the direction of best case scenario. Really, at the end of the day, we're asking, should you do this? We're looking at the technology, we're looking at the consequences that can come from it, we're looking at the impact that can come from it, and we're asking ourselves, should we do this? So that's what goes into the technology strategy. Specifically, techniques now. We're gonna go through some techniques. First is when you map for direct and indirect stakeholders. I realized I should have picked a thicker font because I see everyone squinting at the screen, so I'm reading off as we're going too. But mapping for direct and indirect stakeholders. What do I mean by this? So your direct stakeholder is your end user, the person using your app or your technology or the company using it. It's the direct person that you are designing for. That's only half the picture though. You also have to take into consideration your indirect stakeholders. And these are all the people that are connected to your direct stakeholder. So for example, we are designing a mental health app. The person using the mental health app is the direct stakeholder, but my loved ones around me, my support system around me, those are all my indirect stakeholders. Those are all the people that will still have impact and effect from me using that mental health app. So how do we understand who is going to be impacted? By mapping who are your direct stakeholders and indirect stakeholders, you start to get this bigger picture of, I see what happens if I tweak it here, what happens to my direct stakeholders and what happens to my indirect stakeholders. Oftentimes what we see happening is when startups are creating, or again, within companies are creating technology, they're only focused on the direct stakeholders. And you miss so much of the bigger picture if you're not taking into account those indirect stakeholders, the ones that are being affected by the decisions of a direct stakeholder. So it's essential to map who will actually feel this impact, who will actually be touched by this technology. From there, we move into an impact assessment. And this again is for long and short-term well-being. And I'm reading this all for you with this small font. But why am I putting long and short-term well-being on here? Well, oftentimes with technology, we have a tendency to design for the short term. So as you're seeing, we have a tendency to design for the short-term well-being of our direct stakeholders. So you're probably guessing we're missing a lot of the bigger picture here. Short-term well-being, or hedonia, if you want to get fancy with the Greek terms, hedonia, you're looking at the moment-to-moment pleasure and happiness of your user. So is this user happy by seeing a mental health check mark? I got my check mark for the day. In that moment, I'm happy, but as soon as that check mark goes away, am I still happy? Or has my well-being actually been impacted beyond that moment by seeing that check mark? What I want to do is also consider the long term. That's something called eudaimonia. The interesting thing about eudaimonia is it can work hand in hand with hedonia and with the short-term well-being. Oftentimes for long-term well-being, it doesn't matter. It does not depend on the moment-to-moment happiness. It matters if you feel that like you are growing as a person. Long-term well-being is I as a person am achieving what I want to in life. I'm working towards my bigger goals, my bigger purposes. So when we're looking at our technology, how is the technology a tool for me to work towards achieving my goals in life? Not, am I happy in this moment using it, but is this going to help me in the long run? So a great example of this, we have Instagram. We can scroll through Instagram. We have the momentary pleasure of this cool picture. I like it, done, and so forth. I can move on. Long-term though, if you're sitting there and you're seeing pictures of your peers, say, taking vacations and getting job promotions, and you're sitting there going, I have none of this, what am I doing? That's affecting your long-term well-being. And that's where the gap in design has been missed. So by bringing together the stakeholder, the indirect and direct stakeholder assessment, alongside the long-term and short-term well-being assessment, what you're able to do is start to triangulate, okay, where are the gaps? Where do we need to watch for? Because this could have a negative impact or a negative knock-on effect. But also, where are our strengths? Where do we do really well at? And how do we communicate to our users that this is a tool used for my moment-to-moment pleasure? That's fine. But how do we communicate to that to our users? And how do we design around that? All of this helps paint that bigger picture, that bigger design strategy for your technology itself. And finally, value-sensitive design. This is actually a methodology that you can find widespread on the internet if you Google. It came out of Berkeley, but it's a fantastic tool set if you want a guided methodology. Value-sensitive design was designed out of Berkeley for designers and engineers. And what it does is you sit down with your team, mental AI today, you sit down, you pick your company values, and you go, how does this work in our technology? There are different techniques. There's actually, I believe, about 19 total techniques within this methodology. You pick which one fits your team, but it's all focused on getting everyone to sit down together and ask the question, should we do this? What does this look like? How are the values going into practice? Is this feature being designed to protect the privacy or the transparency of our actual users? These are all big picture questions, but they're very important, and comprised together is what fits and starts to build up that first pillar of technology in terms of ethics. So, Matt, anything to add in terms of technology before we move on?
No, I think it's some brilliant methodologies, especially value-sensitive design. And we will actually get the microphone over to you as well, because some of the Zoom people can't hear. So hopefully this is on.
Thank you. For the stakeholders factor, it's really a question of how far in a radius you go out, how many stakeholders you deem necessary to involve in your evaluation. So do you have any principles, tips because you could go on infinitum, go forever, you'll never get anything done. So what is a good sort of marker of how you actually gauge that effective radius to go out to the stakeholders?
Yeah, because if you're not careful, you can end up, what is that meme of the guy with the strings everywhere and he's turning around going, I figured it out, guys. You can't keep going and going and going and going and building a bigger and bigger web. It is important to sit down for, say, half an hour. You put a time limit on who are actually could possibly be the indirect stakeholders. And you let people's imaginations run wild, but you put it in a time constraint. And then you sit and you go, okay, we have our indirect stakeholders. Who can we actually impact? If a decision that we make will affect this person, okay, they are part of our main indirect stakeholder group. But in some cases, if you are carrying on, doesn't matter what you do, it's not going to change what happens to that stakeholder. So what you're doing in terms of those stakeholders is you sit down and you go, can we actually change what this person is experiencing? No? Well, then they're not necessarily an indirect stakeholder. We can't do anything. So what is within our power and our decision-making that allows us to impact that person? If they are within our impact, then they are a stakeholder of some sort. And that's a great question. Thank you.
Olivia, could I ask a question about the impact assessment for long and short-term well-being? Is that a sort of binary assessment? It either is or it isn't, or is there a kind of sliding scale on that?
Great question, Gary. It's a sliding scale. And it also depends on the user themselves. So companies have, to a certain extent, a responsibility to take into consideration the well-being of their users and to create a platform that allows a user to pursue their own well-being. A lot of cases with long-term well-being, that's really up to the end user quite often. But is the platform or the application of the technology designed to allow and, let's say, empower the user to pursue their well-being, to pursue that long-term well-being rather than just short-term? But it does exist on a scale. It can be further towards moment-to-moment pleasure. It can be further towards that long-term well-being. It's not binary. It is helpful, though, to ask the binary question to get you thinking. Other questions on technology? Great. Thank you, Mike. Thank you, Matt, for running the mic out. Okay, we're going to look at process next. So this is the second pillar to building an ethics strategy. And this one, especially for startups, starts to happen the further you develop. So when you're a young startup, having any sort of process is kind of a Hail Mary. Let's see if any process exists. We're kind of crossing our fingers. But as you grow, it's very important to build the process as you're going. So QR codes again. Same as last time, we have early stage to the left, late stage to the right. And we'll get the results up after. Oop. Oh, the QR code's back. So as we're going, I'm going to talk through this as well. When we're asking, is anyone on your team responsible for AI? Or again, if you're not building AI directly, software governance, technology governance, what we're asking for is someone responsible? Is someone accountable? Now, you do need to have a point of contact for accountability within a company, especially within a startup. We all wish we lived in a world where everyone felt responsible and everyone was going to carry through. In some cases, that's true. In most cases, it gets lost. So by having this responsibility assigned to someone in the company and assigned as the head either to a founder or to a specific position, what you're doing is you're making that point of contact and ensuring that the conversations we're about to have next will be put into action and will actually be seen. So that's why governance is so important. And then for the next question, as Matt's flipping over, are you building trust and transparency into your product? Trust and transparency really comes down to, is there a process that is respecting the user's privacy and a way for feedback? And this works the same for B2C as well as B2B. Do you have that feedback coming in? Do you have that engagement coming in from your users? Is there a process to incorporate that feedback into the product? And are you respecting your users' privacy throughout that process? Again, these are process-oriented questions. So it's great to see the mix of responses here. And I will reveal in our third pillar what exactly you've been taking throughout this process. But thank you for, so far, being very willing participants. We're going to go back to the slides now and continue on with our discussion about process. Building a process strategy. What does this mean? You're looking at your internal processes, whether they exist or not, whether they're in development or not, what kind of processes exist in your company, and are you building the time into those processes to address your values? What this means is we're looking at the necessary governance and policies being built. Sometimes all ethics takes is a good policy and a point of reference for people to discuss. It's also creating that accountability within the company. As you saw earlier with the question of, is anyone responsible for this governance? Sometimes all it takes is having someone sitting at the table going, hey, did we consider this? Did we consider our users' privacy? Are we building trust? Asking those questions in those meetings. Otherwise, they do get lost. So when we're talking about process strategy, we're really just asking the question, how are you doing this? How are we bringing those ethical principles and values into action? Let's talk techniques. Now, these are my three favorites. Let's start with workflows. Workflows are a fantastic way, especially as you grow as a company, to create the right conversations. I was holding on. I cough more when I get excited, which is not helpful. So workflows, what I mean by workflows is designing how are you building your technology. So a lot of teams, especially startups and engineering teams, use workflow called Agile. There are points within the Agile workflow where you can ask the right question, where you can build in elements of value-sensitive design, as we were talking before, or elements of your impact assessments. Workflows are also fantastic because they create that point in time for conversation. So as your company's growing and as you're getting different heads of departments, different teams, your startup is growing, communication is essential. You want your risk team, if you have one, or your lawyers, being able to talk with your data scientist, being able to talk with your founder, being able to talk with your marketing team. If you don't have a point in time in the workflow when you're developing your technology where people talk, the conversation's not going to happen. And that's why the workflow is so essential. We've gone through with companies where, let's take fairness, for example, where the company's going, we want fairness, we think this is important, and they had their data science team and they had their other teams going, yes, we like fairness. And we went, how do you do it? And everyone had a different workflow and a different example. And so what resulted was cacophony. It was lots of different ad hoc attempts at using this fairness metric and this fairness metric. And there wasn't a clear direction of, well, what metric are we using? Is it working for us? What kind of impact are we seeing? Can we adjust it? Nothing. By simply putting in a workflow and going and matching the workflow that already existed, but adding into that workflow, here's the point in time where you talk about what metric you're using. Here's the point in time when you reflect with these people and in your other departments on what that metric is reporting on. Here's the point in time when we assess and evaluate, is that the metric we want to be using? Just by creating those points of conversation in the workflow, you see the team turn around and all of a sudden those conversations that were frustrating were free-flowing and empowering of the team. And they were increasing the actual fairness and accuracy of their technology because they could actually improve on it instead of trying to do it ad hoc. Next, frameworks. And again, when you're a smaller company, frameworks are a little less important, but as you grow, you want to make sure you have those decision-making frameworks put into place. What these look like, a lot of them, a great example actually is, they're outside right now, but the data collaborative for children with UNICEF, I know I got that name wrong, it's a very long name, but they have a research framework. We actually worked with them on that first iteration V1 of that framework. And what it allowed them to do is an easy way to check, how are we doing this? But should we be doing it as well? They were going, yes, no, we have this data. We can't use it this way, but we can use it this way. And it was a way to help with decision making. It was a way to help ensure we have the green light, we can go forward with this, versus red light, we have to have the right conversations or this isn't going to happen. But frameworks help as you develop as a company. And make those critical decisions. The last one, policies and definitions. These are all process focused, but policies and definitions. I can't tell you how many times we've been brought in just to define a word. That's it. But it's so important. For example, again, with fairness. What does fairness mean to you? Is it equal outcome, equal opportunity? What is it? If you don't take the time to sit down and define that together as a team, you're gonna have your team half defining it as equal outcome, others equal opportunity, and then you've got the outliers that have their own definition and no conversations are happening, it's not working. By having the policies and definitions set, what you're doing is you're not setting something in stone, but you're creating a reference point for conversations to happen. You're creating something for people to go, hey, I don't think we're really actually being transparent with our customers because of our policy of transparency and our definition. This doesn't align, talk to me about it. How can we align it? Or do we need to adjust that definition that we have? It's creating that reference point. So really what we're doing with process is we're looking at making this manageable. You have your first step, your second step, your third step. It's an easy way to go about it instead of going, we need ethics. That's very daunting and terrifying, but we need the steps that get us there. So that's process. Questions about process?
So for these three separate comments that you've made, I mean, what form do they take? Are these endless meetings with teams, or how physically do people realize these three factors?
So it depends on the team and how big the team is. Some teams need an actual physical policy document. Other teams need one that exists in a Slack channel. But the important thing is you establish that point of accountability, someone that is in charge of this, where this is part of their daily responsibilities, and they're setting these processes. It doesn't have to be constantly ongoing and further and further and further. It is important with ethics to make a decision and then move on top of it and reflect eventually. It's an ongoing process though, and it always will be an ongoing process. So you'll develop you will develop, say, your workflow, and then your team will grow 6 months later. Can the workflow stay the same, or do you adopt it? It's part of that living, breathing organism that becomes the company. Does that answer your question? Good.
Now, would you regard the pricing as something that you could be part of your ethical framework? And would that be the process? No?
Yes.
Essentially, it would be nice to have an ethical approach to pricing, but ultimately you have to price at a point that's sustainable for the business. So
yeah, what would be work? Absolutely. That is a great example of an instance where you can set up a framework that allows you to say, okay, here's the base minimum of what we need to actually function. Here is the margin that we're looking for, but then set up it so that you have decisions of, are we charging too much? Is this acceptable for the client? Is this going to bring us the needed income that we need to continue to build without breaking the bank or without causing that rift with the client? Frameworks to help with that are fantastic, because what that does is it keeps people making a similar decision. It allows you to assess the decisions you're making, because in some cases you may make a decision early on and decide later on, this isn't working anymore. You at least know where the decision's being made and how it's being made. So you can, it's like a fine-tuned machine. You can tweak it just a little bit. Other questions about process? Matt, anything to add?
The main thing with that price point is the work that we did with one of our clients in price discrimination for a voice calling application. So they created a platform where you can get 5-minute advice across anybody in the world. And one of the main considerations was, what if we get this being dominated by a certain demographic of advisors? Who interacts with that? If this advice is priced too high, how can we actually ethically look at pricing it so we can include more users on the platform and actually make profit from it too, and not curtail the business long term.
Awesome. First 2 pillars, done. Third pillar, people. Because at the heart of every company are the people. And another QR code. This one only has one question though this time. So with this question, we're looking at the social impact. What kind of values does the company hold? Does the company have a mission? Does the company have values? And are they being put into place in a way that's measurable in some cases? Sometimes you need to actually measure your ethics. Sounds counterintuitive, but it gives people something to work towards. So what you all have been taking with this Mentimeter, and that we have sneakily, in a way, have had you test, is actually a due diligence system. So the questions that you have been answering have actually been designed in collaboration with VCs out in San Francisco. And what we've been doing is figuring out how to create easy to answer questions for startups and their founders that allows investors and VCs and angels and all of the above to be able to check, is this company taking ethics into consideration? So 5 easy questions that can be built off of strategy that allow you to create a stronger and better product. So there is movement going on in the startup space and in the investor space towards the importance of these values. That was really easy. I'm hoping you guys all took it very easily as you're sitting here. But that was an easy way to check quickly, where do we stand? If you started to notice, there was a progression in those questions. You have below, you have average, and you have exemplary. An easy way to assess yourself is to go through those questions, below, average, exemplary. What that is going to allow investors to do, as we're working on, is actually be able to look at a startup and go, first of all, this is a risky investment, or this is a good investment, or if we invest in this company, this is where they need support. And first, right off the bat when we invest in them. So it's a tool for founders and investors alike. And it is one that is currently being developed. So you've been a little bit of guinea pigs today. Thank you for going through the Mentimeter with us. But I wanted to give you guys some background as well on what you've been taking throughout this presentation. Slides. Thanks, guys. So building a people strategy. People are messy, and that's beautiful, and that's okay. But what kind of strategy can we have? What does it mean when we're talking about a people strategy? Well, first and foremost, we're looking at the values and the mission of the company. Do those exist? And do they exist more than just on a whiteboard? A lot of companies and startups, well, now less so considering the physical aspect is moved remotely, but you can write them on your wall. That's a good reminder. That's a good place to start, but that is only the first step. You want to make sure that those values and that mission are carried into the culture of the company. Because when it comes down to the day-to-day decisions made by a startup, if that company culture is embodying those values, the decisions being made around ethics aren't necessarily a process that you're going through or a framework that you're going through, but it's part of who you are as a company. It becomes something that you're building off of rather than having to sit there and remind yourself of. So building a strong culture. And then equipping the people with education. Training is important. Understanding what is ethics is important. Understanding what techniques are is important. Understanding terminology is incredibly important, but having that education with the people. So when you're building out your people strategy, you're really just asking yourself, who is doing this? Who is the type of person building this? What are their values coming into it? Who in perspective is this? Techniques. Encourage open conversation. We're gonna link that back to the workflows as well. But when you're building the workflows within your company to enable the open conversation, what you're really doing is you're encouraging open conversation among your company. What that does is allow for the ability to address these questions. They're no longer seen as scary. They're no longer seen as this immovable barrier that people are up against not knowing how to face. Instead, it becomes, in some cases, team bonding or team therapy in other cases. But those open conversations make this part of the day-to-day process, the day-to-day value of a company. What you also can do is create shared terminology. Like we were saying, a definition can get you miles. What you're doing is you're creating a reference point. Again, that's so important. If people oftentimes will see programmers and marketing or founders or legal or ethicists speaking past each other, even though they're speaking about the same thing. By creating that shared terminology, you're creating we'll call it code for the conversations in the first place. And then you can tell conversation is very important. Building time for conversation and training, making this an important emphasis within the company. So ensuring, hey, every third Friday of the month, we're gonna sit down, we're gonna talk about ethics and it'll be great. We'll go out for some drinks and we'll talk about how this works. That's creating time. And those conversations alone make everyone in the company go, I'm not alone. These questions that I'm facing and these challenges that I'm seeing, I'm not alone. They're actually a part of the company culture. And I see my teammate also facing these. And I can work together with that teammate. Instead of feeling isolated, you're together. And you have the training, you have the equipment, you have the knowledge for how to do that. So those are the 3 pillars. Those are the 3 pillars. And so the key takeaways from this, and we're gonna test this out a little bit back on Mental AI app, but the key takeaways here, a good strategy incorporates all 3 of those pillars. So having just one of the pillars, good first step, but as you grow, you're gonna want all 3. But you know your company best, and every company is different. Some companies are going to prosper more from having a strong people strategy and a start to a process strategy and a start to technology strategy, or vice versa. You know your company best, you know what decisions are going to have the most impact and turnaround for you. And this is an ongoing process. Yeah, questions?
So I'm really interested in, you said earlier on, ownership of making sure that workflows or frameworks are actually followed through. You're someone within the team who owns that and make sure they're used. In your experience with customers, because ethics is coming now more and more, isn't it? Is there a team member that you're spotting within that group who ethics tends to live with? Is it the product manager? Is it the developer? Is it who kind of owns the frameworks and the workflows and things like that responsible?
That's a great question, especially with startups, because startups, everyone shares all responsibilities half the time. Quite often we see this owned by either founders themselves or product managers. Product managers are kind of like mini founders within a company, but they will own it in terms of that high level perspective and ensuring it's going into place. We also, whenever we work with a client, look for something called our ethics champion. So someone within the team, and it doesn't have to be the person that's responsible for it or accountable for it, but someone within the team that is wholeheartedly bought into the importance of ethics. Because what they're gonna do is they're seen as part of the company. We're still external. So we're bringing in different thoughts and ideas and experiments. And that can be, well, who are these people coming in to tell us? But if we have our ethics champion within the company, what that person is doing is convincing their friends, hey, this is important, pay attention. So we always look for an ethics champion, but they're not necessarily the one with accountability. The one with accountability, if it's small enough, is a founder, but as the company grows, is usually a product manager. In rare cases, it is also a community manager. If the company has a community manager, we have seen the community manager actually take this under their belt as their responsibility. But those tend to be the 3. Yeah.
So what sort of education should the ethics champion have?
Great question. So the ethics champion, I got too excited again. So the ethics champion, you want them to be educated on the terminology, not necessarily the regulation out there, but on the terminology and the benefits of ethics. Because what they're doing is they're sitting in the company going, we want this because this is really good. It brings us that retention of our friends, our really good fellow programmers that we want to keep. It helps us build a better product. You want them to have that education where they know, I think I've got a strange echo all of a sudden. You want them to have that education where they know we're doing this because it brings us this for the company. That kind of education. They don't need to be an ethicist. They don't need to be trained on how to execute on ethics. They do need to be educated on the benefits that it brings and the potential that it brings for the company, because that's what they're going to be the strongest at communicating to their team.
So this is not finally a home for all those philosophy students looking for jobs.
I would love for, I'm a philosopher as well. I would love for my fellow philosophers to have their homes. And again, they're probably going to be great champions because they're coming from knowing ethics and the intricacies of it, but it's not a necessity. It is important actually to work with philosophers that come from the ethics background because they understand the intricacies of ethics and can work with you on the go. That's one of the things that we've noticed is, especially with startups, you've got fires all day long, and you do need someone that you can consult with throughout the day or on an ad hoc basis where you're like, hey, I'm stuck on this question. My team can't move forward. Did I make the right decision? And if you talk to an ethicist and you hear the ethicist go, yes, you thought that through well. There's this sense of relief. You can see it in shoulders sometimes where they go, okay, I made the right decision. Okay, we can continue. But that's a great home for all of my fellow philosophers. That's a great home for the philosophers, but it doesn't necessarily have to be the ethics champion.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
sorry, give you this.
So a model that I quite like to describe business is that when your brand, your product, and your culture are aligned, then you have a great business. And I think we all recognize that in the companies that we like to deal with. We feel at home there. We feel like the staff are like the product, if you like. And I guess what you're saying is ethics becomes a fourth in that, you know, adds to that trio and becomes a fourth. That ethics has to be aligned with your product, your brand and your culture in order to create an ethical business. So my question is, do you have a good example of a business that does this?
Yes, I actually can pull them up on my phone. So this is actually one of our clients. So I will say that we're a bit, we'll say biased actually towards them, but this is Anyone. They are a marketplace for 5-minute phone calls, advice phone calls. We've been working, oops, so I'm clicking through them. We've been working with them since day one. They took on a UK Innovate grant and started working with us from day one. And we've been working with them on understanding what is the impact of creating a platform where anyone in the world can call you and you can call anyone for advice. Really cool concept, right? Very interesting. I can sit down and I can call an astronaut and ask them in 5 minutes, what was it like walking on the moon? That kind of thing. It can also be, hey, I'm stuck on this question and this problem of, I don't know how to cook garlic for whatever reason. I don't know how to cook garlic. I can call a professional chef and ask them in 5 minutes, how do you cook garlic? But it's kind of like, think, instead of typing into Google, I can just call someone. I can get to have that human interaction. It's a very cool concept. But there's a lot of challenges that they've been facing along the way. For example, they want to prevent the gig economy from happening, or the negative side of the gig economy from happening, where, say, an advisor gets on the platform and this is their only source of income, and they're constantly on the phone, and they're constantly getting 5-minute conversations. What's that actually going to do to the advisor? Will that help them with their long-term well-being, or is it going to be detrimental? What happens if the app goes down and their source of income's gone? What kind of security pieces can they put into place to ensure that someone is not depending on as their sole source of income, but instead they're using it to be able to connect with other people, with other users, with potentially clients? So they have questions like that. One of the cool things that we've been working with them, and literally on the phone with them yesterday, was their advice policy. What does it mean to give good advice? And that's been fascinating. I see you shaking your head. It's a very interesting question because it depends. It depends on the person, it depends on the situation. But what kind of advice should be allowed on the platform versus not allowed on the platform? What could be dangerous advice? What could be good advice that they want to encourage? What kind of style advice? I mean, this is putting people in the place of a power of influence. I can call and I can talk through and say, should I quit my job and move to New Zealand? Well, the person I'm calling, I'm putting a sense of responsibility on. I'm putting that mode of tell me what to do. The advisor on the other end, especially in the case of Anyone, we don't want the advisor to go, you have to quit your job, you have to move to New Zealand, this is the only way to do it. Good advice in that case is the advisor saying, well, you know, in my case, I did quit my job when I moved to New Zealand, and this is why it worked for me. And maybe it'll work for you, but that's for you to decide. What kind of support can you give in that other person's decision so that it's their best intention in mind? I can go on and on about Anyone. The cool thing is it's a very intricate product, and what they're doing is they're building a community and they're building the platform to host that community. And they've taken ethics at the heart of it. One of the coolest things we've seen about it is everyone we talk to, and it's a small team, they're only 12, but everyone in that company says they are proud to be on that product. They are proud to be a part of that company because the time that is given to building it ethically and to building it with values from the start. So we do use Anyone as our hero case study. But that is an example of someone, a startup specifically, which is a little rare right now. We're seeing it pick up more, but a startup specifically doing it good. Other questions? We're bouncing all around. Matt, we should have kept you in your speakers.
Yeah, I wondered if you could speak a little about the law, and maybe not specifically for the UK, but maybe you can touch on other countries as well. So underlying a lot of what you said is effectively ethical due diligence for companies. And by doing so and documenting these processes, one would presuppose that you are building up evidence in support of how ethical you are and being able to protect yourself effectively. Is that required, say, in the UK or the US, or I don't know, but that's important, I think.
Very important and a great question, because it's not required yet. And I'm going to emphasize yet. What we're seeing, especially with EU regulations coming out on AI, there's a move towards needing that auditability within products. Sometimes it's only for transparency sake, sometimes it's only for fairness, but we are seeing that move towards auditability. For startups, it's less important because they aren't going to have that auditing requirement yet. Again, yet, I'm going to keep stressing that, but they will as they grow. So the larger companies are prepping with a lot of the process elements, such as frameworks and workflows, to be audited in the future. But as a startup, if you are building with that in mind of, you know, we're probably going to, in our process of due diligence, to either be procured or to sell to a larger enterprise, need to audit our systems, then instead of having to spend tons of money and time to figure out how to audit in that moment, you have everything already set up and it becomes that much smoother. The regulations are moving in that direction, at least from the EU side. The States, however, it is still a Wild West, but they are looking to Europe. That's been the interesting thing. A lot of startups out in San Francisco will sit there and go, what's Europe doing? Because we want that European market. So we got to build with the European market in mind. Otherwise, we can't expand. So it is becoming a bit of the golden standard. We're going to see how it develops. It is very risk adverse and risk focused, and does require a lot of documentation. So that's more of like a warning sign for future to come. But hopefully a little more flexibility will come from the European side for startups. Other questions? Yeah.
Did you say up at the start about that VCs were becoming more invest on this basis?
Yes, and I guess we'll do a small subtle pitch here as well. We have a quarterly magazine, and each quarter we focus on ethics applied to a different industry. The issue coming out on April 26th is on investing in AI. And so the ethics of investing in AI and ethical AI. That'll be a great resource actually to read straight from investor use cases about the shift in culture of what's happening. What we're seeing is the market is demanding ethics. The younger generations are finding other solutions. There's so many solutions out there. If they feel like their values are being compromised by using a piece of technology, they're not going to use it. They'll find another solution. There's 5 other solutions. And so investors are starting to wake up to the importance of this. They're also starting to wake up, for example, with SoftBank, where they had all these investments, they hadn't done the due diligence on the ethics side, and then it came back and cost them heavily, either in loss of the startup or in legal retributions. But it is becoming part of that conversation of, oh, a successful startup has some type of ethics built into it, has something that we can measure and that we can check for, rather than just a founder saying we're ethical. So we are seeing that shift. This is new though. This is only within, I would say, would have started probably about December this last year. It's a very new shift happening, but it quickly gains speed. One of the interesting things about the investor community, especially, and I'm speaking from San Francisco perspective, Silicon Valley perspective, once it catches on there, it spreads and it's caught and is spreading. So I'm very hopeful actually about the not only pressure, but support and opportunity that the investment community has to actually support startups and encourage startups to start to incorporate ethics.
From the Zoom audience, why do you think so many doubt the ethics of model designers? Limited observations, but I would take the ethics of almost any AI engineer I've worked with over philosophers. I know many of whom I've read. How do we get over this AI modeler anti-bias? have an explainable ethic process? Other ideas?
A lot of points in there. I'm going to try and go one by one, especially the point about I would take the ethics of the engineer over philosopher any day. So we work at ethics. If you haven't figured that out, I am an ethicist. I never go into a client and say, this is what I believe about ethics and this is what you're going to do. What we do instead is we look at what does the society value that this company is operating within? What are the values of the company and what are regulations pointing towards? So think of it as like a GPS system, figuring out what values and what ethics are we going to design for? And that's the important part is you don't want just one person's ethics in the technology. That's called bias. So we're trying to avoid that. The other thing, especially when it comes to engineers versus philosophers, you actually should be buddies. It's a very beneficial relationship. Oftentimes though, it's seen that you're butting heads. The interesting thing though is engineers don't, and I know I'm gonna say something a little controversial here, don't necessarily have the time. They don't really have the time to sit and consider the impacts beyond what the day-to-day coding that they are doing. Engineers don't have a lot of time in their workday. That's okay. I am an ethicist. I'm not asked to code. You shouldn't ask an engineer to code for morals or code morals in that sense or understand ethics. When you work with a philosopher or someone that is trained in ethics, doesn't necessarily have to be a philosopher, but a trained ethicist, what you're doing is you're asking someone that has the both mental capacity, techniques, and practice in actually working through what values are we coding for? What are we bringing in? If they work with the engineer and in that collaboration, that is a beautiful relationship that we want to encourage. But I wanted to focus in on that. You're not picking one person's ethics. It is a collaborative experience. And oftentimes for engineers, it's too much on their plate. So having someone help them, not hold them back, not hinder them, not sit saying you're doing this wrong, instead help them make those decisions so that they can actually work faster at what they're doing and be more efficient. That is the goal of working in this kind of collaborative experience. I don't know if I missed any part of that question. It was a very long question, but hopefully.
I think you covered the main aspect of it.
Yeah.
Any more questions from the Zoom audience? I'm going to be.
We also have Zoom.
Yeah.
Oh, Matt.
Oh, there, sorry.
I'm not sure if this was asked and answered before, but in trying to embed an ethics strategy in, say, new technology, right? You say you need like a heterogeneous mix of minds there, which has all the right feelings to it, and taken in the context of the time, and I'm put in mind of like Nike with them saying, well, we were just following the rules of the space and the employment laws of the region and stuff. But to the users, it was extremely unethical. How have you run into this? What are the thoughts around this when it comes to the realm that we're talking about now?
Yes.
I guess relativism is what I'm getting into.
I am very with the, I'm not going to say a mortal enemy of relativism, but I know what you're asking here. And actually you lead into part of my final conclusion is to be brave. And the whole idea here is, and one of the first points that you were talking about there is when you're working with a team that is designing on models that are in existence, in both business models and technical models that are already in existence, different systems that already exist, a lot of those are broken and a lot of them need to be fixed. And it's going to be scary to actually do something different. But we've come to identify that the systems that exist right now aren't supportive. And so we're going to have to do things different, and that's going to be scary. And that's when you need to be brave. I'll get back to this in just a second, because I know I want to answer your question about relativism as well. So in ethics, and as a philosopher for just a second here, you have relativism and you have realism. Relativism is when ethical principles change per person. Realism means that there are values that exist independent of people. I can debate this for hours with academics, but when it comes to actually working in industry with people, what I say is ethics is just as objective or subjective, depending on what you're talking and in what direction you're going, as data science. And that usually catches people by surprise. But what that means is data science, you have metrics that you measure for. You can measure for accuracy, you can measure for all these different components, but who's picking what you're measuring for? You are. You're deciding, okay, we want this level of accuracy and so on. Sorry, I've run out of tea, so this is, so you are picking what you're measuring for. Sorry, I promise it's not COVID. I need to stress that again. I've taken so many tests. But what you're doing is, again, you're picking what you're measuring for, but you're picking something that is universal. Accuracy across the board is something that data scientists measure for. What level of accuracy you're starting to decide on your context specifically. Works the same with ethics. You have these universal principles. And I know people will debate me on that, but just take a look at the policies that exist. Transparency exists on Beijing and Latin America, European and American alike policies about what makes ethical and responsible AI. Transparency, privacy, responsibility. These are terms that you will see across the board. These are what a philosopher would call a universal truth, but these are the values that exist independent of the company's context. How that value applies to the company context, that's the important part that you have to start to then figure out. It doesn't make it relative. You're still working towards the same, end goal of having a transparent piece of technology. But whether you are in fintech or social media, that's going to look completely different. But you're still working towards transparency. So you're deciding how and what applies in terms of that strength. If that helps answer your question about relativity there.
Hi, thanks. Look, well, you mentioned auditability as this kind of big driver for folks at the moment, thinking about particularly European regulation. And I wondered what the kind of key, the kind of top activities you're seeing startups or teams or larger companies, as you say, is most important, do towards auditability. And yeah, what those kind of look like on the ground.
Do towards, sorry, I missed auditability. Okay. So referencing again back to, sorry, I was good until now. I think my Sudafed's wearing off. I can feel it. That is, we're looking at frameworks and workflows, actually creating the point in time where it's being documented. So it's a little harder in terms of startups because you have lots of decisions being made constantly, but having the key decisions documented, and then as the company grows, actually setting down what decisions need to be documented is the next step. So that when a data scientist or a programmer is making decisions, they know I have to document that I have used this metric at this time, because we'll go back and assess that, where someone can talk to me about using that metric. So by setting the points in time where documentation needs to be made is at least the first step. As startups, they'll start to grow and start to change from rigidity of, you know, this is done ad hoc, or at least we've started to make, we at least know when those decisions are being made, to we're documenting our decisions that are being made as we're growing. Regulation will start to drive a lot of how in-depth that documentation needs to be. We're still sitting on the edge of our seat to see what that actually turns out to be, but we're starting to see that direction of, especially companies that are in finance and health, set those standards, because that's starting to become as well part of the procurement process. Any more questions? I think we go to 3 if I remember right. We're running right on time. I've caught my breath again. So I'm gonna come back and stress. Thank you so much, Gary. Now or we go till 3:05? Oh, perfect. We're good then. So I'm gonna come back and stress real quick as our conclusion to summarize, because I know we have people join us. Thank you all for that we're here the entire time as well. And for those that have just joined us, I'm gonna do a real quick summary of everything we went over and end on this emphasis of being brave. So ethics is important. It's essential to a startup success. It helps retain and build customer loyalty, retain and attract top talent, and increases favorable exits. Those are kind of the three golden pieces of startups. That's what you want to focus on. That's what you focus on when you're building a company. And ethics supports all three of those angles. From there, what does that actually mean? When it comes to doing ethics, we're looking at a strategy. And a good ethics strategy is comprised of three pillars. You have the technology, people, and process. Your technology pillar, you are asking yourself, should we be doing this in the first place? When you're asking yourself, should we be doing this? You're looking at your direct and your indirect stakeholders and their long and short-term impact that your technology is going to bring to those stakeholders. And you're looking at creating strategies around your design decisions. So what does this look like that we're building towards? What is our end goal? So our strategy that goes into what are we actually building? Should we be building this in the first place? That's the technology pillar. We have the process pillar, which is focused more on governance. That's when you're setting up workflows and frameworks and policies and definitions. That is probably the pillar that is done last when it comes to startups, because process is usually done a little ad hoc when you're first starting. But as the startup matures and starts to grow, that process is incredibly important in terms of being able to assess the decisions you're making and ensuring that someone is accountable and ensuring that the conversations are happening. And the third and final pillar is people. We're looking at the culture. We're asking who is doing this and looking at, are we creating time and space for the conversations to be happening that encourage the culture of ethical curiosity, we'll say, where people feel like they're not alone in these questions. I can't tell you how many times we've sat down with a team and they all looked at each other and they went, you too? Same, I was also thinking that. That alone creates that camaraderie and creates that encouragement of, well, we can solve this now that we know that I know that I'm not alone, I have someone I can work with. Creating that culture, creating the terminology and education needed to build that culture. These are the three pillars I wanted to summarize for the people that joined us halfway through. And every company is different. You know your company best. Which pillar is the first for you to focus on? Which are you going to see the highest impact for within your company? You know your company best, but it is important to have the three GPS signals, we'll say. That's how you are going to create that ethical company, technology, team, all of the above. So that's the summary. And the last point on that is it's an ongoing process. As a company grows, so does your strategy. As your understanding of what you're creating grows, so does your strategy. This is not a one and done checklist. This is the start to a journey and a process, really a journey of growing a company. And so the last point, again, be brave. This is a new frontier. There are a lot of people that look at ethics and responsible tech and go, why are you doing this? We'll sit there and we'll say, because this is what's going to differentiate between a decent piece of technology and an amazing success story and a hero story of a strong piece of technology, a strong company. We're going to see hero stories no longer be, let's say, the Zuckerbergs and Bezoses of the world. We're going to see the hero stories of companies like Anyone, with the app that I was showing you of having the company built with care and attention from day one. So be brave. It's a Wild West, but it's worth it. And it's worth that investment of energy and care, because in the long run, that is really what's going to stand the test of time. So that, I believe, wraps this up. We already kind of had questions, but any questions again, I'll turn again. You also have our contact info here. When we work with companies, we really run them through workshops and all of these pillars. We help build these strategies. We run doomsday scenarios with companies to help them understand where their technology is sat in terms of spectrum. So this is us. Any final questions? Cool. Well, in that case, we're ending a little bit early, so we'll get some breathe time. We're also going to do an EI meetup later. We're just going to a pub down the street, but we have some directions in Eventbrite if you want to join us. Matt and I will be there. Also, with Ethical Intelligence, we have an international community of over 60 plus verified ethical professionals. We have a couple of them in town. We're really excited to actually get them all in one place. So we'll be hanging out in the pub, probably talking about ethics. probably some AI, lots of drinking, and a lot of fun times. So if you want to join us later, here's how to find us. That's it.